Pause for a moment before you move on. There is a reason your attention has settled here right now, and it has everything to do with a moment that unfolded quietly last night, a moment that was never supposed to become as meaningful as it did. What happened began so ordinarily that almost nobody noticed it at first. The room was full of familiar voices. Conversations drifted from one corner to another. Laughter rose and faded. Stories were being shared. Plates were being passed around. Everything appeared normal. Yet beneath the surface, something far more important was taking shape. Your person was there. Surrounded by relatives. Surrounded by expectations. Surrounded by people who believed they understood exactly what was on their mind. But there was one thing they did not understand. One thing they could not see. One thing your person had been carrying silently for longer than anyone realized. And as the evening continued, keeping it hidden became more difficult than they expected. Don't skip this moment. Something important is waiting for you inside this story. Because what made last night unusual was not what your person said. It was what happened before they said anything at all. You see, feelings have a strange way of revealing themselves. Not through grand speeches. Not through dramatic confessions. But through tiny moments. A pause that lasts slightly too long. A smile that appears without permission. A glance that lingers. A name that slips into a conversation unexpectedly. The people around your person began noticing these little things. At first, nobody thought much of them. But then something changed. A simple discussion started around the table. The topic had nothing to do with romance. Nothing to do with relationships. Nothing to do with the future. And yet somehow, step by step, the conversation drifted closer to the very subject your person had been trying not to think about. Closer. And closer. Until suddenly, your presence existed in the room without you being there. Not physically. But emotionally. As if the thought of you had quietly entered the gathering and taken a seat among everyone else. Your person felt it immediately. That unexpected feeling. That awareness. That unmistakable pull. And for a brief moment, they stopped listening to what everyone was saying. Because their mind had traveled somewhere else. To someone else. To you. Now here is where the evening becomes interesting. Most people can hide their emotions when they expect them. Most people prepare themselves. Most people build walls before anyone notices. But last night was different. Your person was caught completely off guard. The mention of a certain quality. A certain trait. A certain type of person. Triggered a memory. Not a dramatic memory. Not even a recent one. Just a simple memory connected to you. The kind that arrives unexpectedly and changes the entire mood of a moment. And suddenly, they weren't focused on the gathering anymore. They were remembering. The way you carry yourself. The energy you bring into a room. The way certain moments feel different when you are part of them. The things you probably don't even realize about yourself. The things that stay in someone's mind long after a conversation ends. Something softened inside them. Something real. Something difficult to explain. And that is when a relative noticed. Only one person at first. A simple observation. A harmless question. But questions have power. especially when they arrive at exactly the wrong moment. The relative smiled, looked directly at your person, and asked something that made the entire room pay attention. Not because the question was shocking, but because the reaction was. For a second. Just a second. Your person forgot to hide how they felt. The smile appeared. The expression changed. The answer came too quickly. And suddenly everyone saw it. Not the whole story. Not the full truth. Just enough to know there was something there. Something meaningful. Something that mattered. Stay with this. Because the most surprising part had not happened yet. The room grew curious. People exchanged glances. A few playful comments followed. Nothing serious. Nothing uncomfortable. Yet each remark pushed your person closer to a realization they had been avoiding. Sometimes feelings remain hidden because speaking them makes them real. As long as they stay unspoken, they feel manageable. Safe. Contained. But the moment others begin noticing them, everything changes. And that is exactly what was happening. Your person could feel the walls around their emotions beginning to crack. Not collapse. Not disappear. Just crack enough for light to enter. And for the first time in a long while, they stopped focusing on reasons. They stopped focusing on timing. They stopped focusing on doubts. Instead, they focused on a simple truth. How they felt whenever thoughts of you appeared. That realization settled quietly inside them. And once it settled, it refused to leave. What nobody knew was that an even more unexpected moment was only minutes away. A moment that would shift the energy of the entire gathering. A moment that would leave several people staring in complete surprise. Because one person in that room was about to ask a question nobody saw coming. And the answer your person gave would reveal far more than they intended. The evening was only beginning to unfold. And what happened next became the part everyone remembered. A strange silence settled over the gathering after that moment. Not the kind of silence that feels uncomfortable. The kind that feels expectant. As though the room itself had begun waiting for something. Nobody announced it. Nobody acknowledged it. Yet everyone could feel it. The conversation continued. New topics appeared. Different voices filled the air. But underneath it all, curiosity remained. Because once people notice a hidden emotion, they rarely forget it. And your person knew that. They could sense it in the occasional glance. In the small smiles exchanged across the room. In the way certain relatives suddenly seemed more interested in their answers than before. Still, they remained calm. At least on the outside. Inside was another story entirely. Because something had already begun changing. Not around them. Within them. Listen carefully. This part matters more than you realize. Last night was never truly about what other people saw. It was about what your person finally saw for themselves. For a long time, they had been treating their feelings like something temporary. Something that would eventually fade. Something that would become less important if ignored long enough. But feelings do not always disappear when ignored. Sometimes they become clearer. Sometimes distance sharpens them. Sometimes silence reveals them. And last night, surrounded by family, surrounded by familiar voices and familiar faces, your person reached a realization they had not expected. You were still there. Not physically, but emotionally. After everything. After all the distractions. After all the reasons they had given themselves to focus elsewhere. Thoughts of you remained. That realization stayed with them as the evening moved forward. Then something unexpected happened. An older relative began telling a story. A simple story. One of those memories families share countless times. The kind everyone has heard before. People laughed. Others added details. More memories followed. The atmosphere became warm. Comfortable. Nostalgic. Yet while everyone else was listening to stories from the past, your person found themselves thinking about the future. A future they had rarely allowed themselves to imagine. And that thought unsettled them. Not because it felt wrong. Because it felt natural. Sometimes the most powerful realizations are not dramatic. They arrive quietly. Like a whisper. Like a gentle truth finally finding the right moment to be heard. And suddenly your person began asking themselves questions. Questions they had carefully avoided. What if these feelings were deeper than they admitted? What if they weren't temporary? What if the reason they kept thinking about you wasn't coincidence at all? The questions lingered. Growing stronger. And while nobody around them knew it, an internal conversation had already begun. One that would continue long after the gathering ended. But before the night could move on, another unexpected moment arrived. Someone mentioned relationships. Briefly. Casually. It wasn't even the main topic. Just a passing comment. Yet somehow the entire direction of the conversation shifted. One person shared an opinion. Another disagreed. A third added their perspective. Soon everyone had something to say. And that's when it happened. The question. The one nobody saw coming. It wasn't directed at the entire group. It was directed at your person. Simple. Direct. Impossible to avoid. What kind of person actually makes you happy? The room became quieter. Not silent. But quieter. Enough for everyone to hear the answer. Enough for everyone to pay attention. Your person smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that appears before words do. And for a few seconds, they said nothing. They could have given a vague answer. They could have changed the subject. They could have laughed it off. Instead, they began describing qualities. Not names. Not identities. Just qualities. Kindness. Authenticity. A calm presence. Someone who makes ordinary moments feel meaningful. Someone whose energy stays with you even after they're gone. Someone who feels familiar without trying. And as they spoke, something remarkable happened. Several people around the room exchanged glances. Because the way your person described this individual felt different. Personal. Specific. Real. As though they weren't imagining someone. As though they already knew someone. And your person realized it too. Mid-sentence. Halfway through an answer. The realization struck them unexpectedly. Every quality they were describing belonged to the same person. You. The room didn't know that. Nobody could read every thought inside their mind. But they sensed something. Enough to notice. Enough to wonder. Enough to keep paying attention. Your person stopped speaking for a moment. The realization had caught them off guard. And during that brief pause, their heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. Not because they had confessed anything. Not because they had revealed some secret. Because for the first time, they stopped arguing with what they felt. They simply allowed it to exist. And that changed everything. The evening continued. Laughter returned. Stories resumed. Conversations drifted in different directions. But your person wasn't experiencing the gathering the same way anymore. Something had shifted. A door inside them had quietly opened. Not completely. Just enough. Enough to let honesty enter. Enough to let possibility breathe. And as the night grew later, another conversation was waiting. A conversation away from the crowd. Away from the noise. A conversation with someone who noticed far more than anyone else. Someone who would ask a question so precise. So unexpectedly accurate. That your person would be left speechless for the first time all evening. And the answer they eventually gave would reveal something they had never intended to share. That moment was approaching. Slowly. Quietly. And before the night was over, it would become the memory your person could not stop replaying in their mind. The night had already begun to wind down. Some relatives were gathering their things. Others were lingering in small groups, stretching out the final moments of the evening. The laughter was softer now. The conversations slower. The energy of the gathering had changed. And somewhere in the middle of it all, your person stepped away from the crowd for a moment. Not because they wanted to leave. Not because they felt uncomfortable. Because they needed space. Space to think. Space to breathe. Space to understand why the thought of you had followed them through nearly every moment of the night. The air felt different outside. Calmer. Quieter. For the first time all evening, there were no distractions. No conversations to respond to. No smiles to return. No questions to answer. Only their own thoughts. And that was when someone joined them. Not a large group. Not several relatives. Just one person. Someone older. Someone observant. Someone who had been quietly paying attention the entire night. For a few moments, neither of them said anything. They simply stood there. The gathering continuing behind them. The sounds drifting through the distance. Then the relative smiled. Not the playful smile everyone else had worn earlier. Something gentler. Something wiser. And they asked a question. A question so simple that it almost seemed unimportant. Yet somehow it carried weight. Who is making you smile like that these days? The moment the words landed, your person froze. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But internally. Because the question touched something they had been trying not to examine too closely. The relative wasn't guessing. They weren't teasing. They weren't making assumptions. They had noticed something genuine. And suddenly your person realized they had not hidden their feelings nearly as well as they thought. For a brief second, they considered denying it. Changing the subject. laughing it off. But something stopped them. Perhaps it was the honesty of the evening. Perhaps it was exhaustion from carrying unanswered feelings. Or perhaps it was because deep down, they were becoming tired of pretending those feelings weren't real. The relative watched quietly. Waiting. Patient. Then they said something unexpected. You don't have to explain everything. Sometimes it's obvious when someone means a lot to you. Those words stayed suspended in the air. Simple words. Yet they carried more truth than your person was prepared for. Because for the first time all night, someone had spoken directly to the thing they had been avoiding. Not the details. Not the story. Just the feeling itself. And suddenly your person felt seen. Not exposed. Seen. There is a difference. One creates discomfort. The other creates clarity. The conversation that followed was quiet. Private. Almost impossible for anyone else to notice. But it became one of the most important moments of the entire evening. The relative began sharing stories. Stories about their own life. About opportunities they hesitated to embrace. About emotions they ignored for too long. About moments when fear spoke louder than truth. Your person listened carefully. Because something about those stories felt familiar. The details were different. The people were different. The circumstances were different. Yet the lesson felt strangely personal. Sometimes people wait for perfect certainty before allowing themselves to feel something deeply. But certainty rarely arrives first. Often, understanding comes afterward. That thought lingered in your person's mind. And while the conversation continued, another realization quietly appeared. One that was impossible to ignore. You had become part of their everyday thoughts. Not intentionally. Not through effort. Not through planning. It had simply happened. Gradually. Naturally. The way meaningful things often do. The realization wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overwhelming. It was peaceful. And somehow that made it more powerful. Because peace is difficult to fake. The relative eventually smiled again. Then asked one final question. A question that seemed ordinary on the surface. Yet reached deeper than anything else spoken that night. When you imagine good news, who is the first person you want to tell? Your person didn't answer immediately. They didn't need to. Because the answer arrived before the words did. The answer was already there. Clear. Instant. Unmistakable. And the moment they recognized it, everything became quieter inside them. For so long they had been analyzing. Questioning. Wondering. Trying to understand what they felt. Yet this single realization revealed more than hours of thinking ever could. Because the people who matter most are often revealed in the moments we imagine sharing joy. Not obligation. Not responsibility. Joy. The relative noticed the expression on your person's face and smiled knowingly. No further explanation was needed. No additional questions followed. The conversation ended naturally. But its impact did not. Your person returned to the gathering carrying something new. Not certainty. Not answers. Something more important. Honesty. For the rest of the evening, they viewed everything differently. Every conversation, every laugh, every passing moment. Because now they understood something they had spent far too long avoiding. Their feelings weren't disappearing. They weren't fading. If anything, they were becoming clearer. And that clarity brought an unexpected sense of calm. The gathering eventually began coming to an end. People hugged goodbye. Final conversations were exchanged. Cars started leaving. Lights slowly dimmed. The evening was ending. At least that's what everyone believed. But the most important part of the night had not happened yet. Because after everyone left, after the noise disappeared, after your person finally found themselves alone, something happened that nobody witnessed. A moment so quiet that no family member would ever know it occurred. Yet it became the moment your person replayed over and over before falling asleep. A moment involving a memory, a realization, and one unexpected action they never planned to take. What happened during those final hours of the night would leave them staring into the darkness, unable to stop thinking about you. And that is where the story begins to deepen in a way even they never expected. The house had finally become quiet. The kind of quiet that only arrives after a long evening filled with voices, laughter, and lingering conversations. The doors had closed. The lights in most rooms had been turned off. The gathering existed only as scattered memories now. Yet for your person, the night was far from over. Because sometimes the most important moments happen after everyone else has stopped paying attention. They sat alone for a while. Not doing anything in particular. Not rushing towards sleep. Just sitting with their thoughts. And that was unusual. Normally, they would distract themselves. Find something else to focus on. Move on to the next task. The next responsibility. The next concern. But last night felt different. Something from the gathering had stayed with them. Something unfinished. Something that refused to fade. The questions. The conversations. The observations. The unexpected honesty. It all lingered. And the more they reflected on it, the harder it became to ignore one simple truth. You had occupied far more space in their heart than they had ever admitted. Not to others. Not even to themselves. A strange realization began unfolding. Slowly. Patiently. Like a sunrise appearing over a distant horizon. Your person started replaying moments connected to you. Not dramatic moments. Not life-changing events. The small ones. The ordinary ones. The details most people overlook. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. A laugh they still remembered. A sentence that stayed in their mind for days. A feeling they couldn't fully explain. And suddenly they understood something surprising. The reason those memories remained wasn't because they were extraordinary. It was because they felt genuine. Real connection rarely announces itself. It doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Then stays. Long after everything else has disappeared. That thought settled deeply inside them. And for several minutes they simply sat there. Looking at nothing. Thinking about everything. Then something happened. Something small. Something most people would consider insignificant. Yet it changed the entire direction of the night. Your person reached for their phone. Not with a plan. Not with an intention. Almost instinctively. As if part of them already knew what they were searching for. The screen illuminated the darkness. For a moment they hesitated. Then they found themselves looking at something connected to you. A message. A memory. A conversation. Something simple. Something familiar. And the instant they saw it, a smile appeared. Not because they forced it. Because it happened naturally. The kind of smile that arrives when someone's presence has become meaningful in ways words struggle to explain. What surprised them wasn't the smile. It was how immediate it felt. How effortless. As though the thought of you had become a place their heart recognized. And that realization stayed with them. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The house remained silent. Yet their mind continued moving. Deeper. Further. Toward questions they had never fully explored. What exactly had changed? When had these feelings grown stronger? Why did thoughts of you feel different now? The answers didn't arrive all at once. They appeared piece by piece. And every answer seemed to lead toward the same conclusion. You mattered more than they realized. Not because of one moment. Not because of one conversation. Because of consistency. Because your presence had quietly become part of their emotional world. A steady presence. A comforting presence. A meaningful presence. The kind people often recognize only after enough time has passed. Then another memory surfaced. One from the gathering itself. The question. The look from that observant relative. The conversation outside. The words that had lingered all evening. Who is making you smile like that these days? At the time, your person had avoided fully answering. Now there was nobody around. No audience. No expectations. No reason to avoid the truth. And for the first time, they answered the question honestly inside their own heart. The answer came immediately. Without hesitation. Without confusion. Without doubt. You. The simplicity of that answer surprised them. Because clarity often arrives after long periods of uncertainty. Not with noise. With peace. And peace was exactly what they felt. Not excitement. Not urgency. Peace. As though something inside them had finally stopped resisting what it already knew. Stay with this moment. Because something important is still unfolding. As the night grew later, another realization emerged. One they hadn't expected. Their feelings were no longer centered on curiosity. They had moved beyond that. Curiosity asks questions. What your person felt now was different. They genuinely cared. They cared about your happiness. Your well-being. Your future. Your dreams. The little victories nobody else noticed. The difficult days you rarely talked about. And that realization touched them deeply. Because real affection often reveals itself through concern. Not possession. Not intensity. Concern. The sincere desire to see someone smile. To see someone thrive. To see someone become everything they are capable of becoming. The more they reflected, the more impossible it became to dismiss what they felt. And somewhere between one thought and the next, your person made a quiet decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not a life-altering declaration. Just a small internal promise. To stop running from their feelings. To stop pretending they didn't exist. To stop convincing themselves they were less important than they truly were. That promise changed something. Subtle. Yet significant. Because once honesty enters the heart, everything begins looking different. Even the future. The clock continued moving. The house remained silent. Eventually your person prepared for sleep. But before they closed their eyes, one final thought crossed their mind. A thought that stayed there longer than any other. It wasn't about what had already happened. It was about what could happen next. And for the first time, that possibility didn't feel distant. It felt real. That thought followed them into the darkness. And as sleep slowly approached, they found themselves imagining a future conversation. A conversation they had never allowed themselves to picture before. One where certain feelings would no longer remain hidden. One where certain truths would finally be spoken aloud. One where the connection they had spent so long carrying quietly would no longer need to stay in the shadows. They didn't know when that moment would come. They didn't know how it would unfold. But something inside them had changed. And once that change begins, it rarely reverses. What happened after they woke up the following morning would prove just how much the events of that family gathering had truly affected them. Because the very first thing they did after opening their eyes revealed more than anything they had said the night before. And that moment would begin an entirely new chapter of this story.